Hello, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Um, let's begin. We're 4 minutes after the hour, so let's get started. So the title today is "Tune Out the Hysteria: uh, Tariffs, Iran, and AI Disruption." So we're going to begin with tariffs, and the idea here is that there are some people out there that are concerned that there are not enough checks on presidential power. And there are others out there who think that President Trump, is too constrained. So let's begin there with tariffs and checks and balances in the United States. Certainly over the past year since Trump took office, there has been hysteria over the risks of the expanding powers of the presidency. And people will point to Doge, which is, the aggressive expenditure cuts from the budget that were planned, uh, the threats to Fed independence, and most recently, the Trump's imposition of tariffs. But if you are a devoted Trump fan, you might be frustrated because after all, Doge didn't really accomplish much. The fiscal deficit is just as large as it was under Biden. Uh, when it comes to the Fed is not lowering interest rates nearly as much as President Trump would like. And the Supreme Court just overturned Trump's tariffs. So if you are a hardcore MAGA supporter, you might argue that this entrenched bureaucracy is stifling the president from achieving his goals. Now, I want to point out that checks and balances on the power of the president remain in place and are the backbone of American democracy and the backbone of our political system. And if you are an avid Trump supporter, ask yourself if you would want a left-wing president wielding these types of powers. Now, the Supreme Court struck down Trump's tariffs, and in that ruling, it was supported by 6 Supreme Court justices, 6 out of 9, agreed that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is what Trump used to impose these tariffs, they ruled that these Emergency Economic Powers Act, it grants the president to regulate imports. But regulating imports does not include the power to tax imports. Now, had the Supreme Court agreed with Trump that the president does have the power to tax imports, we could then envision a future Democratic president claiming the power to tax anything that Congress has authorized that Congress has authorized an agency to regulate. So, for example, the SEC is a regulator, and they regulate the trading of stocks and bonds. And since stocks and bonds are regulated, if the Supreme Court had ruled that anything that has regulatory power also grants the president the power to tax, then the executive branch, the president, through his own initiative, not having to go to Congress, could increase taxes on trading of stocks and bonds. How about the pharmaceutical industry? That's also overseen by a regulatory body. And if the Supreme Court had ruled that Trump could impose tariffs through this International Emergency Economic Powers Act, it would also mean that the pharmaceutical industry those taxes could also be increased without going through Congress. The executive branch could just implement tax increases. And anything that is regulated, regulatory is the key word. The Supreme Court decision said regulation does not also include the power to tax. So anything in our economy that is overseen by a regulatory agency, if the Supreme Court ruled that the imports could be taxed by the president, anything that's regulated could also be taxed by the president. So would you want a Democratic president to have that power? I would venture to guess that any true MAGA supporter would be terrified if a Democratic president had that power. Now, President Trump threw a temper tantrum on Friday after the Supreme Court struck down his emergency tariffs. He harshly criticized the 6 justices who ruled against him. But let's note what Trump didn't do. He didn't vow to, and many of his opponents swore that that's exactly what Trump would do if he were rejected by the Supreme Court. So we can say that those who claim that Trump is a dictator of some kind, so much for that argument, right? Because Trump would have ignored the Supreme Court's ruling, and he has not done so. Nevertheless, much of the mainstream media still can't resist the narrative that Trump is nearly a dictator, or a dictator, in fact. Now, for years, the press has labeled the conservative judges on the Supreme Court Trump's lapdogs, right? That's what they've called them. But let's look at how the judges who Trump appointed voted. 2 of Trump's appointees, Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, voted against Trump's tariffs. And again, both were appointed by Trump. Of the 3 justices that were appointed by Trump, only Brett Kavanaugh voted in favor of the tariffs. Now, who opposed, who supported Trump's tariffs? Well, conservative justices Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas both voted in support of Trump's tariffs. And neither one of them were Trump appointees. They were Bush appointees. And then, of course, you had the 3 liberal justices, Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson, all who voted against the tariffs. So that's actually the only thing that's not a surprise here, is that the liberal justices, interestingly, always vote against Trump. And on similar issues, they always voted in favor of Biden. And interestingly enough, Neil Gorsuch, so various justices wrote opinions, and Neil Gorsuch basically scolded many of the justices. And in particular, he scolded the liberal justices on the Supreme Court, saying that, making it crystal clear that in similar cases, they voted in favor of the Biden administration. Just a very interesting little detail. And I've heard many legal scholars say that Neil Gorsuch's opinion is going to go down in the history books as being one of the great, most thoughtful, interesting opinions in constitutional history, constitutional law history. And by the way, just interestingly enough, I actually once knew Neil Gorsuch. We were in the same class at Columbia, and I actually knew him fairly well. A brilliant, brilliant guy, and a super nice guy as well. But anyway, just to return to the topic, what's crystal clear here is by the rulings of Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch, both Trump appointees, it's very clear that once a justice is appointed, they are free to vote, according to their own thought process. They do not need to take into account politics. There is nothing a president can do to them. And this is the argument I've made with the Fed. Once someone is appointed by the president to the Fed, they become insulated from politics and they do not need to be intimidated by a president's views. Now, Trump should view the Supreme Court's ruling for what it is. It really is a boon to Trump's presidency and to his legacy. Why is that? Well, for two reasons. For one, it removes this dark cloud of uncertainty that has been hanging over the economy, that has been especially damaging to small businesses. It's hard to invest and hire workers when you can't project what your costs are going to be the next month or even tomorrow because the president might jack up tariffs again, right? We lived with this constant uncertainty. Yes, we had tariffs, but in 2 days, he might get angry at India or he may get angry at you name the country and increase tariffs. Trump can't do this anymore, right? He can't just turn the light switch on and randomly, because he's angry at a country or a leader somewhere, and jack up tariffs. Those days are over. So yes, Trump is resorting to other tariff powers. He has a plan B. We've discussed that, but those tariffs are far more encumbered, and he just won't have the flexibility to move tariff rates up willy-nilly. Therefore, businesses won't have to worry about the president jacking up tariffs on countries whenever he gets irritated with them. Secondly, and this is much more important, Trump's legacy will not be his tariffs. Certainly unintentionally, his most important legacy may be the creation of a conservative Supreme Court majority that faithfully applies the law and strictly polices the constitutional separation of powers. And going back to Neil Gorsuch and his opinion, that's where he was kind of pounded the table, the importance of separation of powers and the importance of Congress checking the powers of the president and making sure that we don't end up with an excessively powerful presidency. And this is really what the Supreme Court's decision does. It reinforces the power of the Supreme Court, and it encourages Congress to step up to the plate and do its job, which it has essentially abdicated for the last several presidencies. So maybe President Trump will eventually come to appreciate the wisdom of these conservative justices who joined in striking down the tariffs, right? He assailed them last Friday. Maybe Trump will eventually come to appreciate their wisdom, but I wouldn't necessarily count on it. But this check on presidential power is a very important positive for our political system. It's a very important positive for the economy and for the financial markets. And I actually think we're seeing a delayed positive response to this Supreme Court decision, and we've seen the stock market do better the last couple of days. And my hunch is that it is somehow connected to the Supreme Court's decision. So with that, let's turn to the next area of hysteria, which is the war with Iran. And many people argue that if Trump makes a decision to engage or to strike Iran, it could be destabilizing. It could be a destabilizing war. And what I'm going to argue here is that this hysteria is misplaced, and the risk of a destabilizing war is quite small and much lower than it has been in the past. So let's look at the facts. Okay. What has changed? Why would a war against Iran be less destabilizing today than it would have been in the past? Well, number one, Iran's regional strength has been dramatically weakened. Why is that? Because sustained Israeli and U.S. strikes during the 12-day war last year has significantly degraded Iran's proxy network, consisting of the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas, as well as Shiite militias in Iraq. And those proxies, many people don't understand this, but those proxies were actually the backbone of Iran's strategy, of their military strategy, right? It wasn't their own missile system that was really the backbone. It was these proxy networks. And these proxy networks, although they're not entirely wiped out, they have been severely, severely degraded. And Iran has tried to resupply them, but they're struggling. And because these proxy networks are so damaged, Iran's ability to mount a coordinated retaliation against a U.S. and Israeli strike is severely, severely limited. Okay, so that's reason number one why we shouldn't fear of a really dangerous regional war if we strike Iran. Reason number two, the Iranian regime faces profound domestic strain. The economy is in free fall. The rial, which is the Iranian currency, has lost more than 90% of its value over the last couple of years. It is in collapse. And as a result of that, as well as shortages of goods and services in the economy, inflation has skyrocketed. The Iranians measure their inflation rate at 50%. It's probably considerably higher because you can't trust the Iranians in terms of their data, but it's at least 50% a year and probably significantly higher. Um, the corruption in the country is horrendous, and the dismal economic performance has absolutely drained the revolutionary fervor that once existed in this population. And therefore, the state has been deprived of its legitimacy. Further depriving the regime of its legitimacy is the fact that just last month, the Iranian regime killed tens of thousands of protesters over the course of just a few days. So the regime's legitimacy, its credibility at this point has completely evaporated. So we're in this situation where there's economic collapse, its credibility, its legitimacy from a revolutionary fervor standpoint, a religious fervor standpoint, it's been, it's evaporated, and regime support stands at about 10% right now, based on some polling that's been done. So yes, the regime domestically has lost all credibility due to poor economic performance and their brutality. Number three, the U.S. military and the Israeli military, their capabilities have advanced significantly, right, from just a few years ago. Both have precision strike capability. They have cyber tools. They have missile defense systems and offensive drones, which can impose enormous costs without a ground invasion. We always used to think that for the United States to really inflict massive, massive damage and topple a regime, you would need ground troops. You would need boots on the ground. But now the United States and Israel have new tools that are capable of disabling electric grids, destroying missile defense systems, and facilitating cyber attacks. We saw Israel deploy these systems in the 12-day war, and we saw the U.S. With its incredible high precision ability to wipe out or at least massively set back Iran's nuclear capabilities, right? And we saw how Iran was very limited in its ability to respond to that. So that was mostly just Israel during the 12-day war, right? The U.S. got involved, but only sort of for the final touch. But imagine this time with heavy US involvement, actually, the US taking the lead this time around in all likelihood. How much more devastating will these military systems prove to be? So that's the third reason why we have less to fear than in the past. Number four, Iran's leadership, it might be unified, right? We've discussed how we haven't really seen signs of a breaking apart of the unity that once existed. But while it might be unified, it's a severely weakened leadership. Again, going back to the 12-day war last year, Israeli operations killed many of Ali Khamenei's most loyal security officials, right? They killed them, they decapitated them, leaving behind a less skilled and less experienced security apparatus. So that's essential. They might be united, but they're dramatically weakened and less capable, less effective. The fifth reason, Iran's military capabilities are severely damaged. Again, during the 12-day war, Israel destroyed most of Iran's long-range missile infrastructure. They completely wiped out their air defense system. They severely damaged their ammunition depots and radar sites. So we've heard a lot about Iran restocking many of its ballistic missiles, with some estimates even saying they may have more ballistic missiles than before the 12-day war, right? We don't know that for sure, but you definitely have some analysts making that case. But this time around, they have no defensive capabilities whatsoever. So having zero ability to defend yourself from day one is a major, major game changer. And probably, even if they have as many or more missiles than they did in the past, their rocket launchers, and we've heard this, they're severely limited in terms of what they were before the 12-day war on their rocket launchers. So you can have all the missiles in the world, but if you're going to be really slow to launch them, uh, because you don't have enough rocket launchers, then your offensive capabilities are going to be much more limited. And we saw even during the 12-day war, the way to overwhelm your enemy is by launching hundreds and hundreds of missiles simultaneously. But if you don't have enough rocket launchers, maybe you'll get off 10, 20, 30. But those US and Israeli defense systems should be able to knock those down fairly. I don't want to make it sound like it's a cakewalk, but fairly easily. Uh, Number six, we saw that Iran's response to Israeli attacks last year was pretty tepid. And it could muster only fairly limited barrages against a well-defended U.S. base in Qatar and against Israel. Now, this time around, the U.S. has deployed much more advanced air defenses to protect its bases. And it's almost doubled the naval and air assets compared to the deployment during the 12-day war last year. And Israel, for sure, we don't have any details. There's no public evidence on this, but it's a good bet that Israel is probably more prepared this time around than they were last summer. Number seven, the Iranian people desperately want political change. And they have come into the streets in mass, right? We hadn't seen this prior to the 12-day war. And it was just, a month or so ago where they were in the streets in the millions. They will likely do so again if the opportunity presents itself, right? So if the United States and Israel deliver a severe blow, you can bet that the Iranians will be back into the streets. And if you look at regime collapses in countries throughout history, domestic participation from the local population is absolutely essential. And it's pretty clear that the Iranian people are ready and willing to play their part. So for the Trump administration, the upside of acting at a moment of Iranian vulnerability should be enticing because it's pretty clear Iran, the regime, is far more vulnerable today than it has been at any time since this Iranian regime took power in 1979. And if Trump takes the step, as I believe he will, to strike Iran heavily, uh, he would help tip the global balance of power in America's favor and against the interests of China and Russia, who have enormous interests in the preservation of the Iranian regime. So, yes, an Iranian attack, of course, entails risks. U.S. personnel do remain within range of Iran's short-term range missiles. And of course, Israel would be a target. Oil markets could absolutely convulse if Iran disrupts Gulf shipping. And of course, that's entirely possible. But these, all these risks would be short-lived. And it's important to note that the US public and US policymakers, they live in trauma by mistakes that US governments have made in the past. But in wars in the Middle East, most notably the last war with Iraq and Afghanistan. But today, Iran's proxies are weakened. Its economy is fragile. Its population is restless, and its leadership is weak and staggering. So the risks of escalation are less pronounced than at any time since 1979. So I do think we are nearing the moment where the United States is going to strike. As I've said before, my best guess is still mid-March, maybe at the end of Ramadan, but it could come sooner, and I'm pretty convinced it's coming, and that's the bottom line. Now to move to the final topic of Hysteria, which is the threat of AI disruption, which has been really wreaking havoc on segments of the stock market in recent weeks. And so we're going to get into this hysteria. Now, the narrative on AI has swung from one misleading extreme to another. So last year and the year before and the year before that, we had this notion that AI would bring utopia. Some of the technology leaders have claimed that AI would bring enormous abundance, to such an extent that they argued machines will perform most of the intellectual work and most of the physical labor. And human beings will just be displaced by AI and will really do nothing. But that was seen in a positive light. Human beings will largely stop working and we will live a life of leisure, right? This is the utopia version of AI. Now, this was completely unrealistic about AI's near-term capabilities. But more recently, it's been replaced by not a utopia, but instead an AI dystopia. And the critics of AI are arguing that AI will concentrate power in the hands of a few elites. Workers, according to this dystopia, will become economically useless. And society could become essentially impoverished, where most people will depend on subsidies from the government. Now, both of these sets of both of these views, right? The utopia view and the dystopia view, they ignore how economies actually have adapted throughout history to technology. So Why do we have excessively optimistic and pessimistic predictions? Why is it that these predictions are so off the mark? Well, if we look at history, we see that technological revolutions unfold slowly, they unfold gradually. Society and businesses adapt to technological revolutions gradually. So the technology may explode and be awesome and amazing, and all users of AI today will be astonished of the tasks that it performs. But economies adapt these technologies gradually. So economic systems reorganize much more slowly around these new tools that offer huge productivity gains. Economic systems do not collapse as a consequence of new technologies, right? We've never in history seen an economic collapse the way the pessimists think will happen. We've just never seen it, right? Because of gradual adoption. So this dynamic of gradual adoption of new technologies was described by a great economist by the name of Joseph Schumpeter. He did research on technology and the way countries, economies adapt to technology between the years 1911 and 1934. And he argued that innovation, and not only did he argue, he demonstrated with facts that innovation continually replaces old industries while simultaneously creating new industries. And he called this creative destruction. Creative destruction. So you have destruction, but simultaneously you have creation. Now, it's important to note that, like all technology, AI automates specific tasks. AI does not automate entire economies, and that will continue to be the case. So, AI is best understood as a tool that handles specific tasks. But many jobs, in fact, most jobs, consist of dozens and dozens of tasks, not just a handful. So automation removes the repetitive parts while expanding the more valuable human work, right? So if you're a worker, you're going to be, for the most part, liberated from repetitive tasks, and that will free up your time to do more valuable tasks that only human beings can perform. This enhances productivity of every worker. And as productivity rises, companies take on larger and more complex problems, which they didn't even know existed before, right? Technology allows companies, entrepreneurs to realize, you know what? I didn't even know I had this problem. And now that I'm free from repetitive tasks, I realize that I have other problems to solve that will require even more people. So AI will replace repetitive tasks and free companies to focus on more complex problems, which require even more people. Now, let's look more specifically at how AI will create new jobs. So, we said that technological advancement creates productivity increases. And when productivity increases, entirely new sectors appear that didn't even exist before. So let's make that more concrete. I want to give some examples from past technologies. Okay? Examples from past technologies of new industries that were created. So take the internet. We discovered the internet. From the internet, we realized we needed app developers. We needed digital marketers. We needed cybersecurity analysts. We needed cloud infrastructure engineers. Now, let me ask you a question. 20 years ago, who ever heard of a cloud infrastructure engineer? Who ever heard of these jobs? They didn't exist. These job descriptions a few decades ago would have sounded like Chinese to our ears. How about smartphones? Smartphones created things called app economies, ride sharing services, influencer industries. 15 years ago, did anyone ever hear of an influencer? Now, AI is likely to generate similar new sectors in the economy, new ecosystems. I want to take a look at some possible AI era job descriptions, okay? I just made these up. These names don't exist right now, but in a year they might. AI model trainers and supervisors, AI ethics and governance specialists, AI workflow designers for companies, AI data engineers, AI assisted researchers in medicine and science, right? These jobs that don't exist today are going to exist in the future. So people who think they got displaced will find themselves in new fascinating jobs doing research on things that they didn't even know they could do research on. Another great advantage of technology creates lower barriers to entry into the economy, and it leads to more creators. What does that mean? Technology historically allows more people to participate in skilled work. Okay. Let me give some examples of this. The advent of desktop publishing, right? Desktop publishing. That meant that anyone could start a magazine or newsletter. Before, you only had, the big newspapers, New York Times, Time Magazine, Wall Street Journal. The advent of desktop publishing means that so many new entrants entered the market. And now we have all this new sources of information. We don't have to rely on the New York Times to have a monopoly on news. What about spreadsheets, right? How many of you use spreadsheets? Well, spreadsheets, just to give one small example, allowed many more people to analyze businesses, right? Before, only a select few people could do the hard work of analyzing a business and deciding what the best stock is to invest in. But with spreadsheets, it sort of democratizes this industry. And now all you have to do is learn how to use a spreadsheet, and you can start crunching numbers and do your own stock picking. What about AI coding tools, right? AI coding tools. Now many more people can build software, right? This is something that only, again, a select few of people were able to do. Now with AI coding tools, many more people are capable of building software. Again, it democratizes, it lowers the barrier of entry to these these jobs that only a select few could get before. So technological advancement has meant that the number of entrepreneurs increase, right? When you lower the barrier, many more small businesses can be formed. Also, because AI is so powerful, you don't need huge teams, right? You can be a small entrepreneur. Small teams are able to accomplish much more than they could in the past because of these powerful technological tools. And again, entirely new services emerge that didn't exist before. Yes, some services get wiped out, but new ones replace them. Now, all of this productivity, what does it do? It lowers the costs for businesses. And this is important. When businesses begin to automate these repetitive tasks, their costs fall, right? And that means there's more free cash flow, right? And when there's more free cash flow, businesses have more capital to invest in their business and expand and hire new workers. And as I said before, new products are created, new services are created, and businesses are able to expand into unsolved problems, problems that they didn't even know were problems. And actually, new problems are created by technology. So you need more people to solve these new problems. So it is actually a virtuous cycle, right? The pessimists look at this as a vicious cycle, right? But it's actually a virtuous cycle. Historically, this cycle leads to more employment overall, even if certain roles, even if certain jobs disappear. And human beings move up the value chain, right? Routine work disappears, but labor shifts towards more interesting jobs. People were thinking more creatively about medium and long-term strategy for businesses. It will encourage relationship-driven work, right? Relationships become more important. Maybe we have more salespeople, and innovation, right? Innovation. Again, it's a self-fulfilling uh, not self, it's a virtuous cycle. Innovation leads to more innovation. So just to give a couple examples in history, just to drive home the points that I'm making here. We used to have, this used to be heavily a farm country. And then with the Industrial Revolution, we became farmers left the farms and they took jobs in industry, and we had a lot of industrial workers. But with the advent of technological advancement, we shifted to become more of a service economy. So we had more a professional class, right? Many people think that's horrible. Oh my God, we lost so many industrial jobs. The truth is, as with technological advancement, people just moved up the value chain. And more recently, service professionals have become, now we're getting knowledge workers. So people aren't so much in the service industry, but they're doing more research, knowledge, gating knowledge, and that's how they're getting paid. So AI will likely push workers towards more problem solving, scientific discovery, and entrepreneurship, and managing these AI systems, right? You're going to need people with the ability that actually you have all these AI systems, someone's got to manage them, right? Companies have not had to think about that before, but you need people to manage these AI systems. So, bottom line, AI will change work. It will certainly not eliminate it. And in fact, in all likelihood, it's just going to create more jobs. Yes, jobs will be lost, but new jobs will be formed. And this is a gradual process, right? It's the way the financial markets have interpreted this in the last few weeks is, wow, from one day to the next, everyone's going to be out of work. The companies that exist today will be wiped out. And then there's going to be a gap before new companies are formed. We may have to wait years. That's not how it works. It is a slow evolution. It's a process. And you're not going to see massive layoffs from one day to the next because of AI. People will be retooled, retrained. So what will be the real outcome of AI? Gradual automation, new professions that are currently unimaginable, but they will become imaginable slowly. Economic growth will expand, fueled by AI-led productivity. And just as previous generations couldn't foresee things like ride-sharing platforms, streaming economies, right? Watching things over live stream, social media careers. The future AI-driven work might involve curing diseases that we can't cure today, extending the human lifespan, space industry expansion, many, many technologies that we cannot yet conceptualize. So, yes, AI will disrupt many existing tasks, but we know that productivity creates more opportunities than it destroys. How do we know that? Because we have a long span of history to examine what's happened in prior productivity revolutions. We know from history the economy evolves dynamically, not through sudden collapse into joblessness, right? That means it's gradual. You don't shut the light off one day and half of America isn't working. That's just not how it's ever worked. And AI is not going to be any different. And it doesn't seem to be any different. In fact, Jamie Dimon just said just yesterday, that AI is having dramatic impact on JP Morgan. And people's jobs are shifting, but no one's getting laid off because of AI. People's job responsibilities are changing and they're learning on the job. That's the way this is going to work. And that's the way it's working right now. So we took three areas of people kind of losing their mind, being hysterical. One involving a president that is he far too authoritarian? And I've argued, no, he's not. We have a system of checks and balances. There's others who say the president is handcuffed. And I've argued you do not want an all powerful president. Imagine if the president belonged to the party that you dislike. You'd be terrified. So the system of checks and balances is working as it should. Second, we've argued that Iran, there really is the fears are over of a terrible war are overblown. Iran has never been more vulnerable, and the time to strike is now. And third, these AI disruption fears are totally overblown. AI is a very powerful technology. We've had other powerful technologies throughout history, and the economy emerges far better off without mass job loss, without economic destruction. AI will be the same and maybe even better. So, with that, we will pause and see if anyone has questions.